it's been a minute that I've done a live, and can you believe it? On a Friday morning, so early. Well, it's afternoon. It's just gone 12. Well, if you're in South Africa, if you're listening elsewhere, you're probably either earlier, maybe an hour or two earlier. But thank you for tuning in. I know my guest is an hour later, but it's still great to
Earlier.
have him here. Yes, you are. You've got 11 o'clock right now. Hey.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we're talking about sexual dysfunction, and if you're a man struggling with intimacy, with performance, or confidence in the bedroom, then this conversation is for you. Because, first thing to say, you are not alone. Many men talk about sexual dysfunction, some with embarrassment, some with shame, but that's not what we're going to do here. We're going to talk about sexual dysfunction with care, with honesty, and without shame. You might have met Dr. Eli Jubair already. He's a psychologist and he's a sexologist, and he speaks with no judgment, deep understanding, and real answers, even if the conversation is uncomfortable. Welcome again to our conversation. And I know there are a lot of men, they just don't want to go here. They don't want to talk about it. Let's just give context to what sexual dysfunction is.
Thanks, Lynette. Sexual dysfunction for men specifically would be anything that happens during a sexual encounter or even leading up to a sexual encounter. That means that sex becomes either very stressful, not particularly rewarding, or not even possible at all. We have very typical things that we can think about, and that might be anxiety related to sex. So somebody feeling too anxious to initiate a sexual encounter. It might be physical. So it might be somebody who has erectile dysfunction. It might be somebody who finds difficulty with ejaculation, either what's called rapid ejaculation or previously known as premature ejaculation, or what's also known as delayed ejaculation, so the inability to actually ejaculate. And then there are more general things in terms of low libido. Sometimes we have things around pain or discomfort during sex, or sometimes men would report pain in their testes soon after sex. So it's a wide range of things. And we also have to think that depending on whether a man has sex with somebody of his own gender or somebody of the opposite gender or both, or neither, he could just be masturbating, those presentations might change, they might vary, they might be very different.
Why has it become such a hard and difficult conversation to have?
Lynette, I'm not sure that it has become that. I think it has always been a hard and difficult conversation to have. And I think, well, there are myths around this. There are myths around male sexuality, that men
So
should
let's talk
always
about
be.
that for a moment.
Yeah. So some of the myths are that, men should always be ready for sex. Men should always want to have sex. If sex is on offer, a man should always want it, engage it, be able to do that. And then there's also a very close link to masculinity, So for a man to have no problems with his erection ever makes him more of a man. It improves his masculinity. For a man to be able in a heterosexual encounter to um, basically induce an orgasm in his female partner to makes him more of a man. So it's not just about the sex of it, it's also about the symbolism around it in terms of his masculinity.
Mm.
And if there are things around that might impact, that might make it more difficult to have sex. But clearly also, for men to say, I have a problem is a difficult thing. And then to say, I have a problem about sex is
Mm.
a much more difficult thing to talk about, right? But I mean, I wouldn't have a job if it wasn't a thing, if
Yeah,
men
I
didn't have sex.
understand. I understand. I'm
Yeah,
wondering, at what point does a man actually have this conversation with himself and then with his partner and then come to you? Because
sure.
if there's so few opportunities, I mean, it's not, I assume it's not the kind of thing that you talk to your mates about and say, you know what, I'm not performing as I used to, and I don't know what it is about. take me
Sure.
through that process of having this conversation, and when do you notice it, and do you
Yeah.
kind of suppress it and deny that there's something wrong in inverted commas?
Yeah. I think different things for different men, and we can think about it perhaps in age groups. For
Okay.
younger men, and these would often be men who don't know how to initiate sex, for men who have never perhaps had a sexual encounter, or when they have had sexual encounters, they've always felt that they failed or those sexual encounters weren't successful. Those men can respond largely in two ways. They can either withdraw and not uh, sort of seek out any sexual experience at all, and place a lot of pressure on themselves around that, or they can often medicalize that. So they would go to their GP, they would go to their doctor and say, I have this problem, with the idea that, all the ideas around medications. So all
Mm.
the erectile boosting medications, that they would be able to prescribe that, and that would help. And certainly there are instances where that would help, right? But then eventually, if those things don't work, then men would seek out, some form of psychosexual counseling. I think what is also helpful is that younger men are much more likely to use the internet and engage with that. And although they wouldn't necessarily speak with their immediate friend about that, on the internet they can find conversations about that and information about that, and people would then direct them to somebody like myself who work in this. For older men, that's often slightly different. It's often that a sexual difficulty might have been there on a low level for some time, and they've sort of managed to work with it. But as they mature, that becomes more problematic, or there might be a change that they've never had any sexual difficulties and suddenly they do. And then if they are in a relationship, often their partner would encourage them to seek help as well, right? So I think, yeah, a range of things, but those would be the two main areas or ways in which men come to me, I would
Mm.
say.
I'm wondering if Viagra made and became the quick fix for a lot of
Mm.
men without actually dealing with the dysfunction in their bodies.
I think you're right, but it also further perpetuated certain myths, which is that men must always be able to have an erection. Not being able to have an erection is a fault, it's a problem that needs
Mm.
fixing, right? Whereas we need to understand certain things about erectile dysfunction. There is also the understanding often that men have, that not only men, women as well, that these kinds of medications would increase libido, would increase an interest in sex. So when the problem is actually about a lack of interest in sex, not about erections as such, they take these medications. And then what happens? These medications don't work, because how these medications work is that um, a man has to be sexually aroused for this medication to be biochemically activated. If you are not sexually aroused, it won't work, right? Um, so it's not something that's going to make you sexually aroused in that sense, right? And then what happens is that men ignore things, a basic thing like I'm stressed at work or I'm tired, and then I have to have sex, right? And then there's an expectation, but I should want to have sex. And sex should be the thing that relaxes me. But sex could also be work, right? And then
Of
they
course.
might not feel aroused in that moment. And then they think if I take this medication, it will work, and it doesn't, right? So there's a big complex thing that contribute to low arousal levels. If a man is not aroused, he's not going to have a good or sustainable erection. And that is not a problem. That is something to be understood. Why is it that a man is not aroused? And what we find, particularly for heterosexual men, is that they expect of themselves to be aroused and be able to perform sexually despite the situation, despite the circumstances that they find themselves in. If sex is available, they should be able to perform. And clearly, that is, it doesn't take much thinking to realize that is not realistic.
What happens to a man's mental health when you have always classed yourself as someone who's always ready, always very virile? You don't need an invitation, and suddenly you're faced with this. Tell me to understand that.
If a man is highly invested, his identity, part of how he understands himself, is somebody that is always ready for sex, has never had any difficulties, has always been able to perform, and that changes, then that
Mm.
can significantly impact on how he relates to himself, how he understands himself, how he finds a sense of sort of ego strength, a sense of himself in that moment that changes. And that can be really difficult for men. We can then see men become really depressed, becoming angry, becoming perhaps a bit chaotic in terms of starting to use substances to try and manage that. Um, Trying to put themselves in more sexual situations, putting more pressure on themselves to prove to themselves that they can do this, right? And then you have other men who just completely withdraw, who just, you know, might not engage socially at all anymore, who might even start to perform less at work. That would be the more extreme end of
Mm.
things, but it can impact really badly on a man's sense of well-being and his mental health. Yeah.
I can imagine if you are in a relationship that is a extra pressure because you are concerned. I don't want to flirt too much. I don't want to lead my partner on in case it goes a little bit further and I can't perform. So that pressure of not even wanting to pursue it because you have this anxiety that when it's required, you're not going to be able to deliver.
That's absolutely true. That there is the pressure, the performance anxiety of I have to do this. There's the other bit around this, which is um, in heterosexual contexts, when a man has any form of sexual dysfunction, his female partner is more likely to understand his sexual dysfunction as something reflecting on her. So when he has
Mm.
erectile dysfunction, it's because he's having an affair, because he's no longer sexually interested in her, because she's put on weight, whatever the case might be, right? So it becomes then a thing where he feels perhaps blamed that he's doing something wrong, and he has to prove that he's not having the affair by being able to have sex with her. Where of course he's not having an affair or not necessarily having an affair. Um, his sexual dysfunction is about him, not about them as a couple. And so it's also often quite important to work with a female partner, if there is a female partner, about understanding how his sexual function is not about her, it's about him, and how
Mm.
can she support him, including it's okay to, um, you know, be a bit encouraging around sex, but not to necessarily expect him to perform, And I think one thing that we learn from um, men who have sex with men, a sexual encounter is not necessarily an encounter where there's any form of penetration necessary, or even when both men would have to have an erection. Whereas in a heterosexual situation, if penile vaginal penetration didn't happen, then we didn't quite have sex. It's sort of not quite the right thing, right? Whereas there should be freedom for any couple, heterosexual or homosexual, to have the kind of sexual experiences that they enjoy, but
Mm.
also that they feel able to. So if a man is tired from work, is perhaps a little bit stressed at work, and is not, able to have sex in that moment, he might be able to just be present while his wife masturbates, and that's a perfectly reasonable sexual experience if they allow that for themselves. So there's
Mm.
also a lot of permission giving of have the kind of sex that work for you rather than you think you should be having. Yeah.
That's why I stuck to partner using the reference partner because I want us to explore and I want us to cover and not make assumptions that our viewers or the conversation is just based on heterosexual
Hmm.
relationships. That's certainly not what you and I um, do. If you've only joined us now, we're talking about sexual dysfunction. We talk about sexual health with Dr. Eli. He's a psychologist and he's a sexologist. As an initial conversation, I've have a lot of general questions, and I'd like you to elaborate on that. And we are definitely going to talk about women and their sexual exploration and also their sexual health at a later stage. But if you are listening, and I want to reiterate and emphasize this episode is for informational purposes and it does not replace any medical advice, even though Dr. Eli is a medical practitioner. He's well qualified to talk about this. I just don't want this whole conversation that you're having with yourself to fall on us to have to provide all the answers. He is a licensed professional, and I would advise you to also seek a licensed professional advice or book a consultation. But does give his email address at the end if you want to reach out. I'm just putting it out there. So let's talk about, you touched on partners. So some of the most basic questions that comes up is, if I can't maintain an erection, um, even though I'm attracted to my partner, what is happening to me? What's the conversation I'm having with myself?
Hmm. And I think the first bit around that is not to panic and not to start judging oneself, not to start to make it into a problem that you're not having an erection, but it is rather to understand, why am I not having an erection, right? And so, I don't think we can talk about sex if we don't talk about food as well. I think food is a really good metaphor for sex. You might be you might love your partner's cooking and they have a favorite dish, right? But then you've just had a meal unplanned, and then you come home and your partner has cooked this favorite and you don't particularly feel hungry, you don't particularly enjoy eating it, you can nibble a bit but not really so much. That doesn't mean you don't like their cooking, or it doesn't
Mm,
mean that there's something wrong with the dish. It just means that today it's not quite my thing, right? And so there's a similar thing here. If you find yourself not being able to get or maintain an erection in a particular encounter, it is really important to understand, why on this occasion is this not working? And that why is not a critical why. It's not a judgmental why. It's really a curious, help me understand. Let me understand myself. What is happening here? And if that continues to happen over time, then it's maybe something to pay attention to. So for men, particularly men roughly over the age of 40, if over a period of time they have um, erectile dysfunction and there's no real reason that seems obvious, then, as you just said, no, it's really important to seek medical care, because erectile dysfunction at that age could be an indication of some cardiac difficulties or even diabetes. And so if you have that on an ongoing basis, you must have this checked out by a medical professional in the first
mm.
instance, right? You can't just assume that it's because you're not performing, or anything around that. That's typically for slightly older men. And if
So
if
it's
you've not
quite
had it,
normal that your
absolutely,
your your sex drive would adjust or somehow disappear or just
yeah,
be less than
yeah.
what you expect.
A standard thing that I would do is, if a man presents with erectile dysfunction, particularly if he's older than 40, I would refer him back to his GP to have tests done in terms of his testosterone levels, his diet, whether he may or may not be diabetic, as well as his cardiac health, whether he might have
Mm.
hypertension or cholesterol problems or anything like that. And only when those things are excluded can we start to think about the more psychosexual, the more psychological aspect that might contribute to sexual dysfunctions. Yes.
A lot of these questions deals with when I'm becoming aware that there might be a problem. Um, and you spoke earlier about a lot of men whose identity is wrapped up in their performance, and many think and believe that they are less of a man if they can't perform sexually.
Yes, absolutely. I've seen patients who become really distressed because they've never had a girlfriend. They can't see themselves ever having a wife or family because they have some form of sexual dysfunction, and that becomes really distressing for them, because it might not be entirely linked to their sense of themselves as a man. It might be linked to how they want to live their lives. I want to have children. I want to have a wife. I want to have a family, and not seeing that that might be possible because of their sexual dysfunction. This is often the case for younger men, right? What we then also see is that, for not so often, but sometimes it happens for men in their 20s and early 30s who have always been in a heterosexual relationship, then finds themselves somehow sex isn't working, and they struggle with the idea that they might actually be attracted to men or attracted to men as well, and how to bridge that gap, how to work with that. And then the unrealistic expectation of them that they must still be able to perform sexually when they are not attracted to their partner anymore sexually, right?
Mm.
Which is a very complex thing to think about. So, and those are the things where people actually need significant support. It's not something that you can just try and figure out in your own mind necessarily. Some people are, but
That's
yeah,
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering now because if you are seeking either pleasure elsewhere, but you're also aware that your body isn't functioning anymore, or the way that you used to it, you suffer. You might not have diagnosed yourself yet, but with your partner, it seems to be a certain way. But when you're with someone else, how do you then make sure that it's not the partner or it's you? Do you know what I'm
yeah.
getting at?
It, it's a very complex thing that you described there, Lynette, because it's not that somebody might actually have sexual partners other than their partner, right? Our
Mm.
first sexual experiences are with ourselves, and our sexual fantasies and our sexual um, desires are internal. It's about what I want, right? And so I might not have sexual experiences with other people, but my internal fantasy world, my internal sexuality is different to the sexual experiences that I'm having with my partner, regardless of their gender or sexual orientation or whatever it might be, right?
Mm.
And so that mismatch, could be quite problematic in that sense, and so then it is about an understanding of who I am sexually. And from that place, who am I sexually in relation to my partner or partners? And if there is a difficulty there, then how do I start to navigate that, right? There is also a lot of evidence that suggests, although this is done on animals, and we have to think about, again, sex and food. We have a natural desire to eat. We become hungry. And then over that, we have a cultural overlay about what we eat, how we eat, why we eat. So what
Right.
we have for breakfast is not what we have for dinner. What we would
Mm.
have over a religious or a cultural festival to eat and how we eat is celebratory. That's different to having a piece of toast and cheese for breakfast on a Tuesday morning, right? So
Mm.
how we eat, what we eat, when we eat changes, but we have a natural need to eat. Sex the same. We have a natural desire, a natural drive to be sexual. But how we are sexual, when we are sexual, who we are sexual with, there's a cultural expectation, there are cultural overlays, there are ideas around that. And some of those things we may or may not allow ourselves because we would find that difficult, right? And
Mm.
and if we then think about the more biological aspect of it, as I was saying earlier on around animal models, what it shows us is that, particularly for men, when men are exposed to the same sexual partner or the same sexual experience over time, their testosterone levels actually drop. There's a biological response to that. And when the
Mm.
testosterone levels drop, of course, the arousal, the ability to get or maintain an erection, all of that is impacted. And so often for men, there just needs to be a bit of variety if libido drops or sexual dysfunction drop. That does not mean necessarily a different sexual partner. It might mean that not just Tuesday evening, 10 minutes before we go to sleep, we're quickly going to have sex. It might be that we need to go away for the weekend and have a bit of fun, or whatever the case might be. Of course, there's a similar response for women as well, that women have a different response in terms of a long-standing relationship and exposure to the same
Mm.
sexual partner. So the thing to understand here is that our sexual function and our sexual dysfunction is quite a complex clinical picture, and there are many contributing factors that we have to consider and understand. Sometimes
Mm.
it is very simple. Sometimes it is that somebody simply are not attracted to their sexual partner, and therefore for them to get or maintain an erection or to manage their ejaculation is impossible because they're not attracted to their partner. But sometimes it's a much more complex picture.
One of the comments on our last conversation that we had about mental health, I assumed the viewer was referring to finishing early.
Mm,
That's my assumption, and I hope I'm not too far off the mark. But I did say that I was going to raise that. Let's talk
mm,
about that, and also the dynamics when that happens.
Sure.
whilst you are with someone?
So the clinical term for that would be rapid ejaculation or premature ejaculation, which means that a man would ejaculate fairly rapidly after penetration. Sometimes it happens that penetration isn't even possible, that ejaculation happens before any form of penetration. Right? Typically, this is more problematic in a heterosexual context than it would be
Mm,
in a same-sex context. So I'll talk just about the heterosexual context first. So partly what happens is that typically, not always, but typically for women to get to a place of orgasm, they might need more stimulation over a longer period of time, whereas it might be easier for a man to get to that point. And so then when he ejaculates rapidly, it's not necessarily problematic for him, but it is problematic for his partner, and then it becomes problematic for the couple. So we have to, in the first instance, understand where is the problem. Is it that he finds that uncomfortable? Is it that she finds it
mm,
uncomfortable? Is it that they both find it uncomfortable? Where is the problem around that? And then we have to understand, well, what are the contributing factors to that? It might be that for some men, when they are younger, they might lack privacy when they masturbate. And so they teach themselves from a very early age to come to ejaculation very quickly because they fear that they might be discovered masturbating, particularly if they grow up in a home that's not particularly private or where there are strict sort of taboos around sexuality. And so then when they have a sexual encounter, that's what their body is anticipating and how it would respond. And we can work with that. We can teach somebody to then masturbate differently and eventually to delay that. So that on the one hand. On the other hand, for men post ejaculation, there is a sense of relief. There's a sense of calm. Again, that's a biochemical response that actually makes a man relax. Now, if you think about a 19, 20-year-old man who's having initial sexual experiences, where he
mm,
might feel quite anxious in that situation, then for his body to produce an orgasm quickly so that he can have the biochemical response of relaxing makes sense for him in terms of managing his anxiety levels. It does not necessarily work in the sexual encounter situation, and that's then a
yes.
different thing that we need to understand, right? Um, it might also be that some men just are, in terms of the constitution, if you like, they are just slightly more hyper generally. They rapidly do things in any case, and so for those men, there's actually uh, one might also almost say a neurological component to that might make it difficult for them to maintain or to hold back on ejaculating, right?
Mm,
And for that, there is medication that can delay ejaculation. But in the first instance, we would try to understand what is happening and work with masturbatory techniques to try and manage that. But the
mm,
partner aspect of it is a really important bit. And again, there is some education required for the female partner to understand that, when this happens, it is not an indication of her. It might
mm.
be, but it's not necessarily an indication of, him being selfish, him not wanting her to have any sexual pleasure. Uh, it's not anything like that necessarily. Yeah.
Uh, if it seems like I'm jumping all around, I'm trying to keep some of these questions and comments as general as I can, so that in another conversation we can maybe get more deeper a conversation and have more depth to it. A question that comes up regularly and comments that you read about is whether porn messes up a man's sexual performance.
I think the first thing to acknowledge there, Lynette, is that not only men watch pornography, women
Yes,
watch
true.
pornography
Thank
as
you.
well.
Yes, absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. Very
so to
important to say that.
yes, I think that's a really important thing because it's then easy to problematize pornography as causing all of these things. I think
Mm,
that where there is a lack or where pornography can have a negative impact is that there isn't sufficient education and understanding around pornography. So a basic thing would be if you watch any film that's on cinema or on any streaming platform, we would have a general understanding that the people who are the actors are the actors because they are perhaps more attractive and more skilled in acting than the average person. So although we might admire somebody for their looks who's an actor or an actress, and we might desire to look like them, we don't think if we don't, then therefore
Mm.
there's something wrong with us. We are really the most unattractive person in the world. We have a way in which we can engage that, right? But then when it comes to pornography, particularly for younger people, we don't have that same understanding. There is a sense that there isn't the understanding that male porn actors are porn actors probably because they have a very large penis. That is not an average penis. That is a particularly, and that's why they are a porn actor. And so men would compare themselves and think that their penis isn't large enough. And from that can become all sorts of anxieties that can lead to all sorts of sexual dysfunctions, right? So that's just a basic thing, you know. Then the other thing is, yes, if one watches mass-produced pornography that creates an unrealistic understanding of what sex is. So it creates the idea that a man can continue to have sex for hours and hours. Then yes, there might be an impact of the pornography on that. Also, pornography is so easily available now that there is a constant feeding of pornography also, almost, right? And so in that, it's easy then for us to slip into understanding our own sexual experiences must reflect pornography, right?
That,
Uh,
yeah.
and
Mm.
again, we don't have the same thing that, you know, most films have a happy ending, right? Life hardly ever has a happy ending as such, right? Um, Pardon the pun in that, you know.
I wasn't going to go there, but I caught it. I caught it.
Uh, but again, we can engage that. We can think this is a film, and we love watching the happy ending because it makes us feel
Mm.
good. We don't expect that to happen in our lives necessarily, right? But
But
with pornography, we have a different experience and understanding. Yeah.
from what I've read also, that sometimes in terms of therapy and for therapy, it is introduced as a source, at
Yes.
least for a couple to reintroduce themselves to their changes in their body,
Yes.
and as a stimulant, if you will.
Well, pornography can be used very differently in therapeutic context. You know, one of the basic things is that um, women, much more so than men, often don't have an understanding of their own genital anatomy because they are from a very young age, they are raised not to be curious, not to touch, not to inquire. And so then to prescribe pornography for women to watch another woman masturbate is really helpful because she can learn how a woman can reach orgasm, how anatomy works, all of those things. But then what we would typically do, the more helpful aspect of that is not to have mass produced studio, somewhat unrealistic pornography, but rather amateur pornography where it is average real people who find joy in recording themselves having sex or masturbating and putting it online in a safe, consenting way. And then for people to watch that can be educational, right? The same for people who find difficulty with sexual positions, with reaching penetration, all of that. Again, it can be educational, but part of that is not just telling people to view it and that's that. It is about also being able to talk about it. What did I learn? What did I see? How did that make me feel, etc., etc.
Mm.
And you're quite right. And then there are other people who have been in a relationship for quite some time where sex might have become a little bit boring, have become a little bit less exciting and rewarding for both of them. And then to suggest not to watch pornography as such, but what do you do as a couple to help you become aroused? One aspect of that might be to watch pornography together, or it might be to go on a date and make sure you wear something that makes you feel sexy, right? So, yes, there is a use for that, but it is what kind of pornography, in what context, and how do we engage that pornography in a therapeutic way that we understand what we're doing rather than just do something in a way where we've not thought about that. Yeah.
Mm. I just want to interrupt and say that, maybe reiterate that this episode is for informational purposes and does not replace medical advice. You must always consult a licensed professional. We are talking to a licensed professional about sexual dysfunction. It's Dr. Eli Ubar. He's a psychologist and he is a sexologist. And I have to be honest with you, Dr. Eli, there was a stage that I wondered, should we not have this conversation as a recording, firstly, and secondly, behind a wall, that if you want to access it, then you pay for it. But then there's this other side of me that says we need to talk about these topics because it affects us. It affects our relationships. It affects our mental health, our sexual health. And we can't, and not everybody has the capacity or the access to go and see someone or, kind of sit in a space, a safe space where there is no judgment, where you can
Yes.
actually talk to someone about it.
Lynette, I think that in the world, in society, sex is everywhere. Products are sold through sex. Music videos are overtly sexual. So sex is everywhere. It's not that we don't engage sex, but it is at a distance, and it is the sexy version of something. It's not actually talking about sex. And somehow I agree
Yes.
with you. Somehow the idea of talking about sex, being curious about it in a helpful way, trying to understand it, trying to understand what works, what doesn't work, that we find quite uncomfortable, because it is more about us rather than the product of sex, if you like. And I
Yes.
agree with you, so many things in the world, I would argue, got to do with um, conversations we are not having. And sex is one of those things, that these are conversations we are not having. We are not talking
Mm.
about the fact that actually many people have sexual dysfunctions, and because we're not talking about it, when somebody does have a sexual dysfunction, they don't know how to deal with it. They catastrophize. They think that this is only them and it's the worst thing in the world, right? Our clinicians, general practitioners, doctors, nurses aren't trained to ask a simple question. Is there something about your sex life that you would like to discuss with me? Because it feels inappropriate, it feels intrusive if we do that. Whereas most patients would actually welcome it if you give them permission to say, no, I'm fine, I don't need anything to talk about, or yes, I do, right?
Mm.
So I completely agree. We have to have these conversations, and we shouldn't think of these conversations as inappropriate, as overly explicit, as anything like that. It is educational programs so that people can understand their own sexuality.
Yes.
As you said about seeing appropriately trained professionals, yes, I am one of those, but I
Mm.
can only comment on people I actually work with clinically, right?
See.
The rest of it
Yes.
is just general ideas. And so if somebody does feel that there's a specific thing for them, absolutely seek out a clinician that is appropriately qualified.
Mm. Like how many men would actually sit and talk and ask their doctor, um, how do I know if my testosterone levels are low?
I don't think many would. I think if a doctor does not initiate that question, then
How would I know as the
well,
man?
as a man, how would I know? They are telltale signs. If a man suddenly feels quite lethargic, puts on a lot of weight that doesn't make sense for him, has sexual dysfunction, feels low in his desire, um, is a little bit older, around sort of 50 and older, that might be something that you need to check. I would say any man older than 50 needs to have his testosterone levels checked at least once every 3 or 4 years, right? And lower testosterone levels are not necessarily medically problematic in terms of,
Okay.
there would be a significant ill health as a result of that, but it might impact on your sense of well-being, on your mental health, on your sexual performance. And when we think about women, particularly postmenopausal women, for us to be aware of women's hormonal changes and perhaps having to have hormone replacement therapy, that's a conversation we can have. That's something that we can think about. You know, for the average woman in her 50s,
Mm.
she probably at some point have thought about, should I have my hormone levels just checked, right? But for men, we don't do quite the same thing. Now, there isn't exactly the same process for men and women, but over time, men's testosterone levels do drop. And if men find that that's problematic, to have it checked out. It's as simple as going to your GP and saying, could you please check my testosterone levels, right? And whilst you're at it, also ask to have your PSA levels checked, which is about prostate health. And
Mm.
so that both of those things can be checked together. Yeah.
We are going to have a conversation about women's sexual health, but in closing, before you give your email address, um, we obviously going to elaborate and have a deeper conversation at another opportunity. But how do I address the embarrassment of having to have this conversation with my partner? What if I'm uncomfortable because I haven't even dealt with what's happening in my own body? Now you're asking me to have a conversation about it. Um, I'm like, where do you start? The weekend is ahead. Where do you start?
I think human beings, we are actually very compassionate and empathic creatures. We
Mm.
don't like to see
Mm.
people not doing well. We don't like to see people suffering. And
Suffering.
yeah, and particularly when it is our partners, we don't want them to be unhappy or to suffer, right? So the first thing to say to your partner is, I have to have a conversation with you, but I feel ashamed. I feel embarrassed to have this
Mm.
conversation. I'm worried how you might respond if I say this to you. And this is difficult for me to say, right? Now, think about it. If your partner said that to you, you naturally would be curious in a kind way. You naturally would want them to be okay. It's okay for you to have that conversation. Most people would want to do that. And then from that point to have the difficult conversation, it doesn't become easier, but it becomes possible. Right. If we wanted to have this conversation and pretend we don't feel embarrassed, we don't feel anxious, then it becomes so much more difficult because now we have to work at pretending we don't feel embarrassed, we don't feel anxious to have this conversation. Whereas if we just acknowledge it, own it, then we elicit compassion in the other person, but also we don't have to work to pretend it's not there. So we can focus on the conversation we need to have.
Mm. Oh, there's so many questions that have come up during this conversation. I'm glad that we firstly kept it quite general, and we can maybe at a later stage talk more about women's sexuality and the changes that they experience. That's not just all about men, but today it really is necessary, given the conversation we had about mental health. And I would love to encourage you, if you're only meeting us now live here, either on LinkedIn, Facebook, or on YouTube, and you kind of want to get context of where we're coming from, there are two other conversations that we've had with Dr. Eli. The one is about monogamy, very good, and the other one was about men's mental health. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to both those conversations. I'm going to tag with this conversation, but I'm also going to chop it up just so that some of the gist of it, not everybody can sit and talk like you and I can for an hour. I'm going to like chop it up in bite-sized pieces to at least make sure that everyone hears the gist of what you have been saying. Just before I say goodbye to you, your email address again, if anybody wants to reach out to you. And we had said earlier that if you can't speak to you, they can speak to a licensed professional who they trust and who they know. But your email
It
address
is
is
Eli, Eli, at
Eli,
yeah, at HELI JOU
HELIJOU
BERT
BER
.co.uk.
dot .co.uk. Um, and if you can think of any other questions that you have to deal with your patients, please feel free to share them with me as well, or leave it in the comment section. If you are watching this live on the replay, please, I'd love your thoughts. If you're not comfortable commenting, because people all have their moments and not everybody wants everybody else to know their business, and especially not they feel like if they leave a comment they're exposing themselves. You can email me, or you can email Dr. Hubert, Dr. Eli, Lynette at amplifymedia.co.za. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, well, this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. Much appreciated, and can't wait to do a follow up with you regarding sexual health, men and women, definitely.
Thank you, Lynette.
And that's where we'll leave it.